today on the Gravity podcast with my good friend, who, for the purpose of this show, I'm going to call Andrew
You're s-
Grossman.
you're a good man.
Andrew Grossman joins us today. And thanks for being here. This is exciting. I'm
Th-
happy to have you.
Thanks for having me. I love the podcast and I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So we were just chatting before. This is a little unique in that I have known you. We have known each other for most of our lives since we were little children. And in
Yeah.
some way, shape, or form, our families have been friends. Have to immediately shout out Matt, your brother, who's been a lifelong
Lifelong
friend
friend. Yep. Yep.
who continues to be a great friend, brother, other cousins. I mean, we've got a lot of enmeshment in this journey.
Yes, we
So
do.
this makes this interview a little bit different than the normal, and to some degree, it's different because I know your story. We typically are learning things about people going back to childhood that I have no idea. So in
Right.
your case, not that I know everything, I know your journey, pretty well. So this
Yeah, I'd say
makes
you
this
do.
interview a little different, but I still want to, for the audience sake,
Sure.
just give them some background and maybe just talk a little bit about, kind of your upbringing and early days and, things that were impactful.
Well, for your local listeners, I have just a really remarkable upbringing. Right, born, raised, and continue to reside in Bexley. Lifelong resident, except for a good bit of traveling and college, but was back here for law school at Capital. But grew up in a really um, warm, wonderful family in Bexley. I mean, all of my family members. We were extremely close with grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. My brother and I, yeah, actually, my brother and I probably had the toughest relationship until, uh, I say until he grew up a little bit. Uh, but I think about the time I went to college and I didn't have to
Mhm,
deal with him every day,
mhm,
all of a sudden we became friends.
mhm.
But yeah, grew up just a local Midwestern kid.
And I think there's sometimes a feeling, and we kind of talked about this a little bit before, that maybe that's not that exciting or interesting, or it's not some trauma filled childhood that you grew up this Midwestern kid with this really great family. And I think what I have found in doing a lot of these interviews is those stories are equally as important, because people need to know that not only is that possible, but there's something really profoundly impactful about having that kind of a life, right? There's
Absolutely.
no shame in that, the fact that your parents did it right,
Yep.
or that they prioritize family, and that you were in the Midwest. I think even as Midwesterners, sometimes we don't give enough credit to how great it is to be in the Midwest,
Absolutely.
right? So, I mean,
Absolutely.
maybe you could just expand a little bit on what it was like to have, a feeling of being surrounded by family and love, and kind of the ease of being from Columbus, in the Midwest.
So, it's interesting. I mean, because of my professional background, I have a really unique perspective on families today at 52 years old that I never had as growing up.
Hmm.
That I would have never even thought of it. Right?
Hmm.
We weren't quite as enlightened
Sure.
in the 70s and 80s. Um, but what I've learned looking back is, you say, hey, some of these stories are pretty normal and just basic and unremarkable, maybe in some way. And what I've learned is that boring is really good.
Hmm.
Having an uneventful period in your life can be really good,
Yeah,
right?
sure. Right. Careful
And
what you wish for.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. And so, growing up was great as a divorce lawyer and dealing with families who are not doing so well, and having done that for the last 26 or 7 years. I look back at my childhood and I realize, well, I don't know whether I actually had it that good or whether my parents like were they that great? Did they fake it really well? What were
Mhm,
they doing
mhm,
different than it seems like people are doing today?
mhm.
Now being a fully grown adult and having a great close relationship with my parents, I know that I'm sure there were days that they faked it, but I think that it was, just a really uh, true, loving, close relationship. I always used to say, like, they still seem like they're dating,
Mhm,
I mean, as 40-year-olds and 50-year-olds and
mhm,
60-year-olds,
mhm.
some of the ways that they would react, and act with each other, as a kid, you kinda go, "Oh, come on, really?"
Right. And, it is a interesting thing because, there's a lot there. I mean, you see so much today that has to really inform how you see the world, right? And I wanna talk a lot about what you're doing today and that part specifically. But then, there's this other piece, which is sometimes we look at our parents or people or life a certain way without really actually knowing the truth as to what's actually happening.
Mhm.
But in your case, it sounds like you've had those conversations with your parents to really know what it looked like was really what it was
Yeah, I mean,
for the most
I
part,
think for the most part, right? I mean, I'm sure there's still stuff, that I don't know to this day. I think that,
which is probably
which
okay.
is totally fine with me.
Right.
I don't need to know everything.
Right.
I think that today's world, I think just generally people tend to overshare. And I
Yeah.
think that you see that with parents oversharing with their kids.
Hmm.
And, when we grew up, there was more of a divide between parent and child, right? There was that sort of like that, demilitarized zone, right? But
Hmm.
that we just sort of didn't play in, right?
Hmm.
And there was plenty of love and affection and communication and storytelling and sharing going back and forth, but there was definitely, this divide where
Hmm.
the grown-ups kept the adult stuff to the adults.
Yeah.
And I think that in some families that worked really well. And I think that for some families that actually created a lot of problems. Like when
Hmm.
you talk about like, some people have this like sort of trauma filled upbringing, and some have this sort of like, without any of that trauma. I think that it's part of it is what's the level of communication between parents and children? How much are the parents sharing with the kids,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And I think that, when kids see too much, know too much too soon, I don't think that's a good thing.
Hmm.
Um, when kids know nothing, I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I found, and just really kind of making it up as I go, um, that it gets easier to share as you see your kids mature and that there's, an opening to actually share. You kind of can tell. You can kind of feel into it
Yeah.
and tell. But let me back up a little bit because I'm curious. For those that don't know, your father is also a lifelong career divorce lawyer, and I'm wondering how much of him being in that profession influenced how he was as a husband and father, right? So the fact that you grew up in this way, I mean, as you said, you see so much today that has you have a very unique perspective, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you can see, what's working, what's not working, how people handle themselves, why they are the certain way. And I'm just curious, if you've ever talked to your dad about how that influenced how he ended up, being in his relationships.
So, my dad has had built a firm and a reputation as being, the top divorce lawyer and certainly in town, one of the top divorce lawyers in town, one of the top divorce lawyers in the state, nationally recognized and all of that, and was a really like highly evolved practitioner, right? And the practice was way different when he started in the early to mid 70s than it is today. The law was a lot different. But I think that part of him sort of part of what set him apart professionally was how he was able to learn from the mistakes that he was witnessing,
Mhm.
from the things that he was witnessing with his clients, how he was able to learn from that and counsel people through those problems, and how he had the ability to not bring work home except in the good way.
Mhm.
So, like,
Mhm.
when growing up, I mean, I remember him telling funny stories about court or telling stories about other lawyers or a judge, but never any stories about what was going on in one of his cases or
Mhm.
what somebody was going through. I mean, he really just kept that, at the office and
Mhm.
didn't really share that with us. But I think that what he did bring home was all of the knowledge that he accumulated over the years in watching marriages struggle, in watching parent-child relationships struggle, and I think that it made him a substantially better husband and father
Mhm.
than he would have been if he had, gone into the family recycling business,
Sure,
and
sure.
not had that window into the world.
And I'm just curious, and we'll come back to you because I think this is all intertwined, but do you know, I'm sure you do, why your father chose to go into, family practice, divorce law, in particular, it's as you said, it's so different today. But one of the main differences is it's way more common. It's way more socially acceptable. I mean, when he got into it in the 70s, that was not the case.
Not at all.
And so I'm kind of curious, what it was that had him choose that path to begin with.
It's a great question, and I've definitely talked to him about it a lot, and I've gotten sort of different answers over the years as we've sort of revisited it. Right? I mean, his memory just sort of changes. I think all of ours does, right,
Sure.
over time. The things that sort of stick out. I mean, I think the way he got into it to begin with was he was hired by a great lawyer in town named George Tyak, and he was a junior associate there. And one of his first days in the office, George Tyak handed him a file and said, "You've got a divorce trial in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Run over
So,
there."
wasn't as like, I
What?
this is what I wanna do.
Not
Right.
at all.
Yeah, which makes total sense. I was actually watching the, Golden Globes last night, and the host, this comedian, made a joke about how, like, where he's from, you always take the money.
Yeah.
You just if they offer you the job, you take it,
Right.
and
Right.
so, maybe when you're a young aspiring attorney and you get a job somewhere, I mean, even today, you kinda you take a job if you can get it, and you do
Yep.
what you have to do, and if they say you're got a divorce case, next thing you know,
That's what you're
you're
doing.
a divorce attorney.
And the law is famous for that, right? Law firms are famous for that.
Mhm,
The young guns come in, new kids come in, and the senior partner says, "This is what you're doing today."
mhm.
And it might have been nothing that you planned for.
But I find it fascinating, though, because if you think about how random that might seem, but to then end up not only spending his entire career in that lane, but then how that influences how he is as a father and husband, and what that does for his children, and now to have you doing the same, pretty incredible that, somebody hands you a file and then all of that ends up, being impacted.
I mean, I guess that's what life's all about, right? Is an opportunity comes along, and you take it, and you don't know where it's going to go.
Right.
I mean, it could have been a one and done for him. He could have gone over, done that case, and done a terrible job. And George could have said, "Okay, we're not going to send you anymore. We're not going to send you to divorce court anymore. You're going to just do the criminal stuff." And
Yeah.
and he could have taken a different path. It's you
Yeah.
don't you kind of don't know what is behind door number three.
Sure. Yeah. Sliding doors.
Yeah,
Okay. So back to you. So, and actually, maybe we should talk a little bit about your mom, um, and kind
she'd
of,
be very disappointed if we didn't.
yeah, and so let's do that, because maybe, most people know you and your dad, like you said. Your dad was really well known in town, still is, and you practiced together, had a radio show together, newspaper column. I mean, you
Yeah.
guys have been out there together. But your mom is obviously, not even behind the scenes. She's playing a really important role. And I guess what I want to get curious with you about is how you were as a kid. right? Which, I know, but share with the audience what you were like as a kid and how your mom was influential in, that time of your life.
It's the '70s and '80s when I'm growing up, and it was a very traditional household. My dad was generally gone to the office by the time we woke up. Maybe he woke us up, or was the first one to start waking us up. And then he'd come home about the time we had dinner. And so most of my time was with my mom, right? I mean, she ran the household, she
Mhm,
ran the family, she was responsible for my brother and me, and I mean, she was kinda everything to us. I mean, she was in many ways, and it continues to this day that, that she's sort of the glue that held everything together.
mhm,
I mean, I think that she still plays that role in our family, today with my brother and me, with our children,
mhm.
with the extended family. Um, she's just great. She's the best.
She is, and the glue, I think, is a great way to describe that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, people that know you, I think, to be intelligent and successful and interested in a lot of things and articulate, involved in the community. But, I know you back far enough that that wasn't always who you were. Same true for me.
Yeah.
There were a lot of years, in high school in particular, where academics were not the focus. Fun, partying, other things, right, seem to be way more important. And yet, here you are. And so, I'd like to just have you maybe share a little bit about kind of, the pre-academic,
Yeah.
party part of your life, and then what changed for you, or if in anywhere in that period of time were you thinking at all that the end result might end up, being a lawyer?
I always looked up to my dad. He was always sort of my hero. So there was always a part of me that wanted to be a lawyer. When I was a kid and in high school, and probably I'd say at least half of the way through college, I don't think I ever would have told you that I would have come into his practice and then wound up practicing law with him for, the next 20 years.
Mhm.
What was not on the radar screen. I wanted to be like him,
Mhm.
but I didn't necessarily want to be him and do what he did. I wanted to be like him in a lot of just sort of personal ways.
Mhm.
But no, as a kid, I'd say that my focus was not squarely on academics for the lion's share of my academic career. Some might argue the entirety of my academic career. Um, there's a guy here in town, and I'm certain you know him, Jeff Kaplan. Erie Chapman was running Riverside Hospital, and Jeff was his, I don't know, his vice president. I don't remember what the title was,
Mhm.
but Jeff, I think, started his professional life in the admissions office, I think at Yale. And Jeff did on the side some college counseling, and I needed some counseling. So my dad had met Jeff somehow, and Jeff just sort of on the side for maybe one kid a year, maybe not even, would help kids with college counseling, and I definitely needed help getting into school because I had a particularly unremarkable academic career at Bexley, squarely in the middle of my class. I had great SAT scores, so I had the capability. I just didn't execute very well at all. And Jeff said, I think the only way I really wanted to go to Syracuse at the time. And
Mhm.
Jeff said, the only way we're going to get you into Syracuse is we need to get you an interview. You're going to need to go there and interview. And so I went into the interview, and uh, the college counselor comes out. He's like the associate dean of admissions, and he comes out, and he's just this big athletic guy, and kind of an imposing character. And he brings me into his office. He says, "Okay, I've read your essays. I've looked at your scores. I've looked at your transcript. I read your letters of recommendation. I only have one question for you at this interview." And that just scared the hell out of me, right? And he said, "So I see you're graduating from public high school with a 2.6, and I see you got a 1400 on your SATs or whatever the number was."
Mhm.
And he said, "So my one question for you is, did you fuck around in high school or cheat on the SATs?" And I said, there's no good answer to that question, is there? He says, "Nope." And so I said, "Well, then I'm gonna have to go with honesty and say I fucked around in high school." And that's, I mean, that's word for word what the interview was. And then he just sat back. He said, "Okay, what questions do you have for me?" And I wound up getting in. I didn't go, but I actually wound up getting in. And
Yeah,
so Jeff was sort of just a great guy to help me sort of
sure.
start to see,
Yeah,
oh, maybe there's a reason
yeah,
that to try in
yeah.
school. I wound up going to the University of Kansas, and I had just a lot of fun
Mhm,
my first year.
mhm,
So that it didn't quite all sink in that I needed to work really hard.
mhm,
My sophomore year, though, Kansas is known for Jayhawk basketball and tornadoes. And there was a tornado drill. It wasn't a drill. There was a massive tornado
mhm,
storm, massive tornadoes ripping through Lawrence. And there was an announcement over like the public address system says, get in, take shelter immediately. And I'm walking back from class. So I ducked into this building I'd never gone into, and I went into the basement. And the basement was the study abroad office.
mm.
And so you talk about like my dad getting
Yeah,
the
sure.
file from George. So I'm sitting in there, and this storm lasted for hours, and we had no cell phones. I didn't have a Walkman with me. There's just like one old lady sitting in the study abroad office. There's nobody else there. And so she started talking to me about studying abroad, and I read every brochure, and I took all the brochures home, and I got home, back to the fraternity house a couple hours later, and talked to my parents that night. My mom had watched CNN and saw that there were storms, so I had 9 voicemail messages. She was always looking out for me, and I called them, and I'm talking to my dad that night, and I said, "Yeah, I think I'm gonna go abroad next year." And, which just stunned him because
Mhm,
it had never crossed my mind, and it certainly had never crossed my lips,
mhm,
to say it. And so I gave him some ideas of some cool programs I saw. There was this marine biology program in Fiji, and he said no. And I'm like, I could go to Australia. He's like, no. And I
mhm,
said, there seemed this really cool program in Oxford,
mhm,
and he said, "That's what I'm talking about."
mm,
He said, "I can get behind that."
mhm,
He says, "Find a program that is academically challenging."
mhm,
And so I applied. I got into this program, and you know, again, no internet, not a lot of communication. We're
mhm,
leaving in August. In July, I get this thing in the mail at my parents' house, and it's the roster of the kids that are going on the program, and it was name, hometown, and university. And I go down the university list, and it's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn, Michigan, Stanford, Harvard, 4 or 5 Dartmouth kids. And then there's this kid from Ohio who goes to Kansas. And I'm thinking, I know these guys are thinking I'm showing up in overalls for the
yeah,
flight over, right?
right.
That is the moment that turned
Yeah,
for me
yeah.
academically,
Uh-huh.
is being in an environment
Yeah,
where I was with people who we were there. I mean, most of them were there to take a break from
yeah,
their really rigorous studies
yeah,
and have some fun and tour Europe.
sure.
But they were really smart
Mhm,
kids, and they were really involved kids, and they knew a hell of a lot more than I did about what was going on in the world.
mhm,
And so just hanging out with them every day, I think some of that interest
mhm.
just sort of seeped it
Yeah.
through.
Yeah, because I was curious, when somebody isn't performing at a high level academically, oftentimes they end up telling themselves a story about how smart they are. In your case, you get the high scores, SAT scores, so I mean, internally you're capable. I didn't know if you always knew that or what it was that had you connect the dots that even when you said you didn't wanna do what your dad did. You wanted to be your dad. You didn't see yourself doing what he did. I was wondering, is that because you didn't see yourself as, somebody that could go to law school or was smart enough or any of that? Or it was just, you weren't thinking about applying yourself that way at that time?
To be honest, I think that I thought it was cool to not try.
Yeah,
I
sure.
mean, that is my high school and part of my college experience,
Yeah,
was that it was cool to not try.
sure.
I liked walking out of Bexley at the end of the day without a backpack.
Yeah, You thought it was cool.
all my
Yeah.
books were in my locker.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
right? And all I was doing was just, screwing around, and I don't even know sitting here today what 17-year-old me thought about my intellectual capabilities.
Mhm.
I don't think I ever thought I'm not going to go into the law because I don't think I can go to law school or make
Mhm.
it through law school. That I don't think crossed my mind.
Mhm.
I just don't really think that I gave it a whole lot of thought.
Yeah. Right, because you were more focused on what was cool,
Yeah,
yeah, hanging out with friends, things that were fun,
yeah,
and that just felt right. Makes sense. Okay, so let's fast forward a little
yeah,
bit. You do end up, and the Oxford thing. I know from being friends, how impactful that was, and how that was really a big shift for you. Still to this day, I mean, I
yeah,
know you think so fondly of that experience,
yeah,
which is amazing. I think it's an important thing to highlight that when we sometimes really change it up, get way outside our comfort zone, do something that's literally, in another part of the world, traveling in particular,
yeah.
just how much that can impact you, change your life,
Absolutely.
and it did for you. So you end up going down this path, and once you flip that switch and you decided that you did want to go down this path, was it immediate that you wanted to go down the path of divorce law to go into practice with your father? Or was it just, hey, you know, I now need to focus on my academics, and you started to kind of peel it back a little at a time?
So I was definitely there was a part of me that really wanted to practice law with my dad. I didn't have necessarily a burning desire to be a divorce lawyer
Hmm.
when I started out. And when I was looking at law schools, I was looking locally and I was looking nationally. And my dad said, "Well, if you're going to practice here, if you want to come into my practice," and he never pressured me to come in. He says, "If that's something you want to do," because I'd mentioned it, he said, "It makes better sense to go to law school here and start building a network and getting to know the legal system where you're going to practice," which made a lot of sense to me. So that's what I did. And I went to Capital Law School. And I think it was the summer after my first year. I got an internship with one of the great lawyers that Columbus has ever seen. His name is Frank Ray, and he's an amazing guy, and a terrific lawyer. And he did class action lawsuit, product liability, personal injury, plaintiffs work, and so nothing like what my dad did. But my dad didn't offer me a job. He wanted me to go find something somewhere else and see what I was interested in. And, probably after working for Frank for about a year and a half, I realized, that wasn't probably the kind of practice that I wanted to be in. And having spent more and more time with my dad, to walk from law school to my apartment, I had to pass his law office. So I had to pass his
Hmm.
office. So I'd stop in every day.
Hmm.
And after being around there and being with the guys and people that were there, I just realized that's where I want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and you've been in practice with him now for how many years?
So I've been practicing since 1996. So
Okay.
yeah,
So let's talk about what you do. And what I'm curious about is, boy, there's a lot there. You had mentioned how much you learn about people, about life, about relationships, about what people are bringing to all of that. How much of that comes from childhood or other things that are, very similar to what we typically unpack here on the podcast. You have, in many ways, a real intimate front row seat to people's lives. I mean, you probably see stuff that um, very few other people in your client's life see, right? They
yeah,
they probably share with you some of their deepest, darkest secrets, right? You really are seeing a humanity at a pretty deep level over and over again every day. So
yeah,
I just kind of, maybe I'll just leave it there, just for a second, and just let you respond to that. Maybe just give us some insight on what it's like to do what you do, from that perspective.
So it's interesting. We talked about my upbringing and it being nice Midwestern trauma free. My first day as a divorce lawyer is when I realized how sheltered I was,
Mhm. Mhm.
because the people that walk into your office when you do what I do, are sharing the most intimate details of their life
Mhm.
within 30 seconds of meeting you.
Yeah.
It's a very weird, unnatural thing. I mean, you spend a lot of time on this podcast, like, really extracting a lot of information from people. Um, and I have to do that in an initial consultation. But it's so personal, right?
Mhm.
It's so personal. And it's the things that they don't tell their friends, they don't tell their family members. It's maybe me and their therapist,
Mhm.
right? And so the first couple of years in practice, I think I was a little bit shell shocked at how terrible people can be to each other, because I had seen none of that in real
Mhm.
life
Mhm.
in my upbringing. I mean,
Mhm.
it was a jolt, because and look, it's not that every divorce is, what you see on in the movies, right?
Right.
It's not that every divorce
War
is
of
trauma
Roses or
filled and
yeah.
raw. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not. Most
Yeah.
of them aren't, to be
Yeah.
honest. But you hear these things, with the people that walk through your door, who are people who are really struggling, people whose families are falling apart, their marriage is falling apart, and they're sharing all of this information with you. And for a pretty sheltered kid who lived in a really warm, loving household with an intact family, it was sort of like, what's happening?
Mhm. So I get that. I could see how that was, a real eye opener for you. And maybe you just elaborate on, what was happening or what happens, when people are at that point. I mean, and I know it's a lot of things, right? It's not the same for everybody, but if you had to kind of, boil it down to a handful of things, what happens, um, generally speaking, that have people end up at that place in life. I mean, and I listen. My parents were divorced. I'm not a stranger to it. I understand to some degree, but I'm trying to pull back the curtain a little bit and really
Yeah.
get your understanding from the perspective that you have.
So I think the common denominator, um, uh, generally with divorces is, um, boils down to communication or a lack of communication. I mean, that's really so people love to, talk to me at parties when they, know what I do and they want to hear stories. I mean, it's,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
kind of like that. It's like looking at the gossip pages, right? The question I'm probably asked the most is, all right, what's the main reason people get divorced? Is it an
Mhm.
affair?
Mhm.
And I always say, that's probably never the reason that someone gets divorced,
Mhm.
because an affair is a symptom of a problem. Because no happily married person goes out and has an affair.
Mhm.
I mean, could you have an indiscretion if you were happily married? I suppose so, but
Mhm.
but nobody steps outside of their marriage, gets involved with somebody else when they are happy at home.
Mhm.
It just doesn't happen.
Sure.
And so I think that whether it's when you hear people say, "Oh, we just grew apart." What is growing apart? I
Mhm.
mean, I think really that boils down to, a failure to communicate
Mm.
along the way,
Mhm.
right? I mean, people can take there's no question that a couple can grow apart, take different paths.
Mhm.
I mean, interests change.
Mhm.
You talk about like those opportunities, the tornado, and then that changed my
Mhm.
stuff, the file with my dad.
Mhm.
But I really believe that if a couple is committed to working on communication and actively working on communication, and communicating truthfully with each other,
Mhm.
um, I think that you probably don't wind up in my office.
Mhm. Interesting. And I guess what I'm imagining is, a lot of people don't understand that's what's going on, right? So they come in with a story. and it's so and so had an affair, or she's this, he's that.
Mhm.
They have a lot of attachments to what they think is happening. um, and so when that's going on, and I mean, I don't know, is that common? Is that generally what people are doing when they get to you?
Yeah, one of the I'm sure I have, past clients and probably some current clients who are gonna be mad at me for saying this. But when people come into my office and say, I had no idea
Uh-huh.
this came out of the blue,
Yeah.
the first thing I think is, "W what bullshit."
Yeah.
I mean, that's your eyes are not open.
Yeah, but when you say bullshit, they're bullshitting themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I mean, there are always signs.
Yeah.
They're always there.
Mhm.
It's just, are you paying attention to them?
Mhm. And so when you bring that back to communication, so that's where you're saying the breakdown in the communication is that there's signs, something's off, not right, and you're not talking about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, listen, what do we do every day, right? We get up, we go to work, we take care of our kids, we get them
Mhm.
off to school, we make sure that, everybody makes their appointments, we make sure that, everything is taken care of, we're paying our bills, we're fixing something that broke at the house. I mean,
Right.
just everyday life.
Right.
And at the end of most days, most people are just tired,
Mhm. Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's easy to just at the end of the day sit down and want to, look at a screen or get involved in a book and just shut the outside world out because
Mhm.
I've just dealt with stuff all
Mhm.
day long.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
it's actually something I really have struggled with and have really had to be really aware of in my personal life.
Mhm.
I spend all day long talking about other people's problems, addressing other people's problems, and trying to solve other people's problems. The first thing I want to talk about when I walk home is probably not a problem
Mhm.
at home, but we all have problems at home that we have to address.
Mhm.
So you have to really be aware. You have to try.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know from my own experience, I think, what happens is it's a bit of like dealing with an acute pain versus a chronic pain, right? Like in the moment, addressing the problem feels like it's painful or not something you have the energy to do, or you've been busy all day and it's the last thing you want to do now but if you don't, it turns into a chronic pain, and that's way worse.
Way worse.
Right. And that is, I think, how relationships fall apart. I think you're right that, you have to, if you listen to like the Gottmans, bubble up the conflict. They say that the couples that stay together are the ones that argue the most, actually, because they're at least talking about stuff. Yeah, so I get that. I mean, there's a layer under that, and maybe this is I don't know, not in your wheelhouse. I don't know, but I'm imagining you have a perspective on it for sure. And that, like, it's like, well, why is that the case then? Uh, you know, James Clear in Atomic Habits talks about, and Katie was actually just talking to me about this, that that if you look at how you spend your time, you can look at where your priorities are, right? So why is it then that we are so tired that we can't actually address the things that should be most important to us?
Yeah, you might be out of my wheelhouse, right? I mean, I might be a little over my skis on this one. I don't know why that is. What's went through my head, and I don't know that it's a real direct answer to this to what you posed,
It's
but
okay. Yeah.
what went through my head was, what I think has changed a lot. You talked about like how divorce when I was growing up was not nowhere near as common or as accepted as it is today.
Yeah.
What I think has changed a lot is the focus of the couple. I think that couples today are so singularly focused on their kids,
Mm.
putting their kids first,
Mhm.
that they don't tend to the relationship.
Interesting. Yeah.
And, back when I was growing up, um, I don't remember whether it was Friday night or Saturday night. whichever night the Love Boat and Fantasy Island was on,
Yeah.
right? Every single week, my parents were out.
Yeah.
They were out with themselves, they were out
Yeah.
with other couples,
Yeah.
right? They always took time for themselves.
Yeah.
And, you didn't have the travel soccer and the travel
Right.
basketball and the
Right.
travel tennis and all that kind of stuff that
Right.
that we're all doing with our kids, or a lot of people are doing with their kids. And
Yeah.
and I just think that we focus a little too much on our kids. We make if our kids are a bigger priority than our marriage, then it's the marriage that's going to start to fall apart.
Mhm.
And what happens when a marriage falls apart? There's fallout for the kids,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So by spending all of our time focusing on our kids, to the detriment of our relationship,
Mhm.
when these relationships fall apart, we wind up not having done our kids such a favor.
Yeah, and we were talking about this a little bit before, just how certain things become a little bit more accepted. That's a very interesting point, by the way. I think you're right. In fact, I'm referencing the Gottmans because I Katie and I both just read this book, and we can put links in the show notes. But I'll butcher the title, but basically it's like 7 days of kind of tiny habits that you can exercises that you can do as a couple, and their whole theory is that it's really small stuff, that it's not some big thing that you have to fix. They don't even want to hear what your big issues are with your spouse. They want you to just focus on doing a few tiny things, one a day for 7 days. One of them is a date night. And they say that the number one thing that makes the most impact in a relationship is taking a date night, and a night where you don't have your screens on. And they say it's not supposed to end in sex. There's no expectation. It's just about connecting and talking and being together, and how important that is. And I think you're right. We easily get away from that because we're so busy. So let's talk about today, and how much divorce has changed in your career. I mean, certainly going back to when my parents were divorced, I can remember my parents got divorced, I think in 1985. I was 10 years old. And it was like a big deal, right? Like,
Yeah,
and it was like not just a big deal, it was like, wow, like a sort of a big, stush in the community,
yeah,
like a black mark on your, record that you've been
right,
divorced,
right.
Um, and boy, things have changed so much. I mean, now it almost seems like maybe it's become too easy or too acceptable. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it just seems like it's changed so much, even in the last, maybe 10 years.
I think it has changed in the last 10 years. And it's definitely changed over the 26 that I've been practicing. I mean, what my day looked like, what I dealt with 26 years ago on a daily basis and today are vastly different things. I have several fairly strong thoughts on this.
Okay.
Number one, I think that we live in a bit of a throwaway society,
Mhm.
right? Everything is disposable, everything is replaceable. The new iPhone comes out. My old iPhone is pretty much the same phone
Mhm.
and it works,
Yeah.
but I'm getting the new iPhone.
If you don't
Uh,
like the Instagram picture, swipe to the next one. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's so easy to just move on. That there was this probably, I don't know if it was maybe half a dozen years ago or so. I remember reading an article. There were actually several articles that were coming out, and they were talking about the starter marriage.
Mhm.
That there were a lot of people that were like getting married young, and they really weren't necessarily thinking that it was a forever kind of deal.
Mhm.
And they gave it a shot, and then okay, now I'm going to go on to the next one.
Mhm.
And I just think that people are so used to being able to replace. It's so easy to give up, and because it has become there's not that black mark, right? I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, people still talk in the community, and
Mhm, mhm,
yeah, you're a topic of conversation for,
mhm.
one round of social parties, and
Right,
then it's somebody's on to
right.
the next thing that they're
Mhm,
talking about in the community.
mhm,
So, I think that because it's more common and it's more accepted and
mhm,
it's not that black mark, that there's sort of less of a barrier. We talk about barriers to entry, a
mhm,
barrier to exit,
mhm,
less of
mhm,
a barrier to exit.
mhm. I think to some extent that's not all bad, right? In that, there seems to be, at least like the changes aren't all bad. There seems to be a lot more of a roadmap, a blueprint on how to do divorce civilly, kindly, respectfully. If you do get to that point, we see a lot of um, friends of ours that are divorced that are wonderful co-parents that are happier in their new lives than they were when they were married, and consequently they have a better relationship than they did. It does seem like to some extent the kind of dynamic has changed in that there's an option that has it not being ugly, and that it can sometimes just not be something that was meant to be forever, and that can be okay. You see that too?
I definitely see that, and contrary to A Marriage
So
Story.
yeah, 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 I
Okay,
think so. Adam Driver, yeah.
yeah,
Great movie, yeah.
great movie, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And like there was like the ball buster lawyer, and
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
Alan Alda was the
Right.
nice, calm, easygoing guy,
Yeah,
all that kind of stuff.
yeah.
So I mean, the sort of general image of what a divorce lawyer
Yeah.
is really far afield from what most of us are doing
Mhm.
every day.
Mhm.
Most of the divorce lawyers that I know, that I practice with and against every day, are genuinely committed to removing barriers and
Mhm.
obstacles, to eliminating things to fight about, to
Mhm.
resolving things peacefully.
Mhm.
And it matters a great deal when you're divorcing with younger kids
Mhm.
that still have some raising to be done,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Because not every relationship is built to last.
Yeah.
Not every marriage is going to make it.
Yeah.
Some marriages are better off ending,
Mhm.
right? We didn't know that when we said I do, maybe, but after a while,
Mhm.
some relationships, they run their course, and it's best to end it. And if you've got kids that you're raising, how do we avoid as much of the fallout?
Mhm.
There was a psychologist in, I think, the 70s, did a study, Judith Wallerstein. I don't know if you've ever, I know
No.
you dig deep, but
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah,
if you've
no,
dug
no,
that. I don't know if you've
no,
dug that deep
not
yet.
that deep.
And I think that, she did this study a long time ago, and the grand conclusion of the study was stay married for the benefit of the kids,
Uh-huh.
which was very much a 70s
Sure,
mentality.
sure.
And then her students who were involved in the sample groups got together, went back, found the kids of the sample groups, and said, "So what was that like?" And resoundingly, the conclusion was the opposite of the
Mhm,
conclusion from the 70s,
mhm,
which is that's the worst reason to
mhm,
stay married,
mhm,
just for the kids.
mhm,
Because if the relationship's not good, I mean, we kids learn how to have intimate relationships from watching their parents
mhm.
primarily.
Yeah. Yeah, it's again, having been a child of divorce, and seeing how that's played out in my own family. In fact, speaking of movies, Katie and I just went to see The Whale, Brendan
Yeah.
Fraser, The Whale, um, and it rocked me. It really hit me very hard in that there was some interesting family dynamics. So, a divorced family, and um, seeing kind of the dynamic, at least, maybe this is was more true when I was a kid, where the parents are, far from on the same page, and how that can actually impact the kid. There's no doubt that sometimes divorce by itself can be incredibly hurtful, harmful to children. Now,
Sure.
um, also, no doubt that role modeling a unhappy, no intimacy, bad communication, or worse relationship could be equally or more harmful to the kid. So, one of the questions I have for you is I wonder sometimes, how many people, to your kind of first point, just bail too early, right? Like, how do you know? From your experience, can you tell the difference when somebody is like, I'm on to the next thing, this thing's too big of a pain in the ass, or when they're just not willing to do the work? And if they would do the work, getting to the other side, keeping the family together could actually really be a way better outcome.
There's no question that there are and there's no question that I can that those exist, that people that bail too early that just aren't willing to put in the work, that
Mhm.
if they had, they probably would have been successful. Um, and yeah, I can identify those uh, some of the time
Mhm.
at the initial consultation.
Mhm.
If
Right away you can see it.
right away,
Yeah.
here's my sort of initial benchmark. If you're in my office and you haven't been in a marriage counselor's office,
You're not you haven't done the work.
you haven't tried.
Yeah. Yeah.
You haven't tried.
Yeah.
So, I've got great relationships with a bunch of marriage counselors
Yeah.
in town.
Yeah, I bet.
One thing that I learned from my dad, I mean, he's a really sort of good, moral, ethical guy,
Mhm.
person, just a good person. And, he instilled a lot of that in us.
Mhm.
My mom the same way. But the only people that I've ever, I don't like to use the word encouraged, but let's say encouraged to get divorced are people who are in abusive relationships where
Mhm.
they're at risk.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, for everybody else, um, I say your first step ought to be a marriage counselor,
Mhm.
not an initial consultation with a divorce lawyer.
Mhm.
Some people come in, they just want to get a lay of the land. They want to know, what's this going to cost? What does
Mhm.
it look like? What's going to happen to the kids? Is it
Mhm.
true what I heard?
Mhm. Mhm.
My
Mhm.
neighbor who got divorced, only sees his kids every Thursday, and I
Mhm.
don't want to do that. And,
Mhm.
so some people are just fact finding.
Mhm.
And it's probably better to fact find in my office than online because
Mhm.
there's a ton of misinformation
I'm
out there.
sure, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you're coming to me and you haven't gone to counseling, and I'm not talking about 2 appointments,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Like, actually really
actually
having put in
trying,
an effort. Yeah.
actually putting in an
Yeah.
effort. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, and this is just sort of curiosity, but I'm wondering how many of those people that you send to counseling, as a first step come back if they really do the work.
So it's a little hard to know because it's hard to know why somebody didn't come back.
Okay.
Okay, like, did they
Yeah.
stay together? Like, I don't really do
Right,
a
you're
whole
not
lot of outreach.
following up with
People
a
don't wanna hear
survey,
from
yeah.
me, after the fact, right? So
Especially
so
at your rate.
Fair enough. Touche. So, I had a conversation with a marriage counselor, here in town, somebody that I know that you know,
Mhm,
and, I had sent a bunch of clients or potential clients, to him
mhm,
and, for marriage counseling, and, he called me one day and he said, I wanna thank you, so and so came in and, you've been unbelievable, for my practice, like referring so many people to me. I just want you to know how much I appreciate it. And I
mm.
jokingly said to him, I go, you could have maybe a worse success rate, like,
Yeah, right. Send some back.
send
Yeah.
some back,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
yes, the answer is yes. If
yeah,
people, I mean, if people are committed to trying,
yeah, yeah.
like, of course you can make it work.
Yeah. I think, what I've heard, relative to other similar things, in like the addiction world, they say, get sober and then you can decide,
Yeah,
right? Like, if that's the problem.
right.
And so it's like, do the work and then you can decide,
Fair.
right? And I guess I was going to ask you earlier. I was thinking, how many people end up in second marriages or third marriages just repeating the same shit because they're not actually doing the work on themselves. The advice that I have uh, received over the years, which I hated the most, which was absolutely the best advice, is you can really only work on yourself. Yes, you have to work on your relationship, but at the end of the day, the work that you can control is the work that you do on yourself.
That's true.
And so I'm wondering, how much of that ends up putting people in a new relationship with the same problems.
I don't know what the actual statistics are on the failure rate of second marriages. I'd be surprised if it wasn't higher. The failure rate
Mhm.
wasn't higher in a
Mhm.
second marriage than a first marriage. I think that there are a lot of people who don't do the work, who don't change, who just think, well, he was the problem or she was the problem.
Mhm.
And now I'm going to find somebody who doesn't have that problem. And oh, then some of the same problems are coming up.
Mhm.
How didn't I see that in him or her?
Mhm.
Number 2, how didn't I see that when I
Mhm.
when we got together?
Yeah.
And maybe the answer is you need to stop looking across the table
Yeah.
and start looking in the mirror.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I've had a number of clients who I've represented multiple times.
Mhm.
And the first one that I represented for the third time, when he said, shouldn't I get a repeat client discount? I said, no, there should be a surcharge
Mhm.
because you haven't learned anything.
Okay, so let's talk about just you know circle back around to what you've learned. The communication. How does all that you have learned really impact you as you go about your life? You see so much. Again, just kind of like, I don't know, underscore it or double click on it, like the bottom line on what you've taken away from having this front row seat to humanity.
I want to just repeat the communication component, but there's more. There's definitely more to it. I, I don't know that there's a bottom line. I mean, I think
Mhm.
that the communication piece is the bottom line, right? It's
Mhm.
sort of the common denominator
Mhm.
in all of this. Um, you know what I have learned, like I've had a front row seat to watching and dissecting a lot of mistakes
Mhm.
that people have made
Mhm.
over and over and over. With this front row seat, I'm able to recognize pretty clearly a lot of mistakes that people make
Mhm.
over and over. Hopefully, I'm doing a reasonably good job at not making those mistakes at home.
Mhm.
I know I'm not anywhere near 100%.
Mhm.
I mean, I know I'm not.
Yeah.
Um, and there are things that happen in my daily life, my home life, where I think to myself after a discussion, a disagreement, whatever. I think to myself like, man, how did you let that happen?
Mhm.
How did you get sucked into that? Like, you've watched so many people make the same mistake.
Mhm.
One of
Mhm.
the things that I've learned, and I wish I was better at it. I mean, I am trying, is that being right is overrated.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's really overrated.
Mhm.
Winning an argument,
Mhm.
overrated,
Mhm.
right? It's just
At home.
at home.
Yeah.
No, I mean
In the in the in the courtroom,
in the
it's
courtroom, it's
pretty important.
vital.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, in your
Yeah.
home
I
life,
got you.
in
Yeah.
your home life with
Yeah.
the people that you love,
Yeah.
winning an argument.
Yeah. Boy, I'm sure there's a lot more we could unpack and talk about. It's fascinating. I think that sometimes people look at divorce and lawyers law, as sort of black and white, and it's just not, because really what you're talking about, I mean, even as you honestly share about, how you're imperfect and how all these things, but we still find ourselves making some of the mistakes, hopefully less of them, but making mistakes, it's because we're all human beings and
Mhm.
we're all bringing. I mean, I think the answer to the question of why is it that we don't do the things? Why don't we prioritize? Why is it we're so busy? Um, it's because of everything that happened before it and everything that's happening around us.
Yeah.
Right? There's a conditioning that happens at birth, and you can have unbelievable, unconditional love, really wonderful childhood upbringing, and still society can knock you around and tell you what matters and what's important, and money or status or things or experiences, even if it's well intended, can take you away from maybe what you should do or what deep down is most important, and we just get off track. And, hopefully we don't get too far off track, but I guess, maybe that's the gig is trying to, keep coming back.
I guess the key to, avoiding divorce is I don't think you have to stay on track the whole time, but you gotta be, like, within shouting distance of the track,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't veer that far off
Yeah.
course,
'Cause it's really hard to get back.
because then it's
Yeah.
really hard to find your way back.
Yeah.
But there's no marriage in the history of marriage that has stayed on track
Yeah.
from "I do" to death.
Right. Right.
It's not a thing.
Especially as we live a lot longer and
Sure.
right,
Yeah. Well, there was a child of the '80s, and there was this line in St. Elmo's Fire that says, "Marriage was invented by people who were lucky to make it to 20 without being eaten by dinosaurs. Marriage is obsolete." And the guy responds, "Dinosaurs are obsolete. Marriage is still around."
Yeah,
Um,
that's great. Well, it wouldn't have been a successful podcast if you didn't quote St. Elmo's Fire, so I'm glad we got
it's
that
one of my
in.
weaknesses.
Yeah,
Guilty
it
pleasure.
depends on how you look at it,
Yeah.
I think it's a strength. So,
Yeah. Thanks.
anyway, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for
I don't know
having
if you have
me.
any final thoughts, anything else you wanna share. We'll make sure people know how to find you, not that you're looking for work, but,
No,
um,
you
yeah,
know, I appreciate you having me on. It's nice to be able to talk about what I do sort of outside of actually doing it,
yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, I spend all my time doing what I
right,
do, not and less time than I probably should reflecting on what I do. So it's a sort of a good, like, personal and professional gut check to come
yeah.
in and have a conversation like this.
Yeah, good. Well,
Yeah,
it's been fun.
I enjoyed it.